This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the podcast. This episode is sponsored by gardencourses.com. Gardencourses.com offers online horticultural training for those looking to develop their own home gardens. There are 3 courses available online this month: Small Space Big Harvest, Creating an Urban Wildlife Garden, and 4 Seasons of Colour. Go to gardencourses.com to find out more. This week's guest is Nigel Palmer, an experimental gardener who brings to bear his experience as an aerospace engineer to analyse, identify and organise the various components that make plants grow well. From his research, he's compiled a recipe book of garden amendments, some easy to make and some involving more complex methods, but all of which you can recreate at home and use on your garden for better plant health and resilience. I started by asking Nigel if he could describe how he came to gardening and to authoring the book.
Yeah, sure. Well, I've always had a garden myself since my early 20s. Being in the garden is just such a wonderful way to communicate with the earth. So many of us spend time in an office or not outside, and we lose track and we lose touch with what's going on in nature. And gardening provides a respite from the materialistic world and allows us to hear and experience what's really going on around us. Gardening was fun when we had children. Teaching our children where food came from was very important. And of course, that tomato from a garden always tastes better than the one in the store. For some reason, it's worth thinking about that. But there came a point in time as we got older that we recognized that the food from the garden was more than food. It was medicine. And as the food we buy in the store has changed over the last 40, 50 years, this became more and more important. And I've never used any chemicals. I've never bought anything in the store to put on my garden. But this, as anybody knows who's done that, if you don't do something to the soil, then crops don't grow as well. People always say, well, I always used to be able to grow broccoli, but I can't anymore for some reason. So I started to look around for ways that indigenous people used and fertilized, if you will, let's use a funny one, amended their soil to grow high quality food year after year, millennia after millennia. And I started experimenting in my backyard with some pretty stinky stuff and finally found some resources that talked about different methodologies. And then my wife started a school called the Institute of Sustainable Nutrition, TIOSN.com. And in the school, she recognized that food starts from the garden. It's all about the soil. And she asked me to do a class for the school. And we thought originally it would be a couple of classes and that would be it. But it soon became a core part of her program. And after about 7, 8 years of doing this sort of thing, maybe 10 years of doing this thing, I recognized how important these recipes were and these ideas were for people to grow food in a sustainable manner without polluting the soil themselves, without supporting the manufacture of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and things like that. And so I thought that it would be really important to write a book and get these ideas out there so that mainstream could not only understand them, but also utilize them and learn from them, give them a starting point from which to grow from. And so put out the book, and Chelsea Green was kind enough to publish it for me.
Yeah, you mention in the book another book called Natural Farming Agriculture Materials by, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Cho Ju-Young.
Yes.
And I just wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit about what is in that book and how it influenced the way you garden now.
Yeah, so this book was an amazing find for me. I think I found that about 2010. And I had been looking for some time for resources defining how indigenous people gardened. and I'd find the odd thing here and there. And I think agriculture has these techniques, but whether or not they're documented in a book somewhere is difficult to find. And when I found this book, it was essentially listing many different recipes, specifically IMO, indigenous microorganisms. And yeah, that was a winner for me. It was like, okay, wow, here's a way forward. Here's something that I can do that I didn't understand. And so it really didn't change the way that I was looking at things as much as it gave me the tools to facilitate those things. The book itself was very difficult to interpret, but the ideas were there. And I used that book to learn many of the techniques and recipes that I use today.
Yeah, so you make your own soil amendments and fertilisers, and as part of that process, I believe that you had them analysed in a laboratory. And when I was reading the book, what I thought was interesting was, you know, obviously you can adhere to a recipe, but I'm guessing there are variables. So once you've invested in having your products tested in a laboratory, how do you know that you'll be able to kind of replicate the values that you found in them in future batches?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, the first thing you can do is you can do multiple tests and determine the statistical variation. And I'm in the process of doing that over time. And but the best resources that I found was James Duke's Phytochemical and Ethnobotanical database, which is available for free online. And in that, it provides ranges of minerals that different plants have. So while there is going to be some variation, there's general guidelines of what each plant might have in it, which is really fascinating. The other thing is that the proportions of minerals will vary depending on the extraction method. And in the table that the data in Appendix E, I provide different analysis of different methods of extracting from the same plant. And so it really gives an idea of what you're getting out of plants mineral-wise, and depending on the extraction method. And the extraction methods really are very, very simple, simply putting plant in a bucket of water all the way to fermenting them, and then further fermenting them or using vinegar to extract from the fermentation residue. So the easy answer is I didn't know, but by looking around and getting some information from James Duke database, it became clear that there were ranges that would be had. And that allowed me also to start looking at different plants in different ways. Okay, I need a source for manganese, for instance. Well, what plants generally have high ranges of manganese, for instance? And then go look for those plants in your local area to ferment them to get very specific on the specific minerals that you might be interested in.
Yeah, that was a key word, actually. You mentioned there, local. And this is a concept that I've come across very recently. But you mentioned in the book that local biological material is important for a garden. And that fascinates me. Why is that?
Well, one of the things that's learned early on for me was how soil biology is so misunderstood. One of the amazing things that is easy to figure out is that we only know about 10% of the names of fungus and bacteria that are out there. There may be millions of them out there, but we only know the names of 10% of them. And then archaea, which is a new life form discovered in the last century, is another form of biology in the soil that we know even less about. Never mind the interactions of all these biologies. So there's a tremendous amount we don't know about them. The next thing is that the biology varies in the soil seasonally in elevation, depending on if they're in the sun or in the shade. So soil biology has an amazing amount of variability associated with it. So when I start thinking about, well, what biology do I want in my garden? To go and buy something in a store that lists, I don't know, a half a dozen types of biology and a half a dozen kinds of fungus seems almost irrelevant to me when I can go and harness the actual soil biology in my area and get hundreds of thousands of varieties of bacteria, fungus, and archaea in proportions that are very specific to the local area, and I don't even have to guess. They're here. So this takes an awful lot of the guessing out of inoculating your soil. The other thing is that the diverse biology translates into resilience in the soil, a redundancy of actions to feed the plant. As you may have read and know, the plant actually feeds the biology in the soil, 25% or more of the sugars created during photosynthesis. So plants are actually determining what local biology is in the soil they want to facilitate to get the nutrients they need in order to become healthy. So having a diverse as possible soil biology allows better selection from the plants, and it allows a redundancy of those soil biologies to capture and transform minerals into forms that the plant can use. So I capture biology at different points of the year in the form of IMO2, and I keep it in a refrigerator. So when I want to inoculate something, I can actually inoculate seasonally based on the biology that I capture, but generally what I try and do is put as much biology variation as possible into any particular inoculation.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. There are so many things we don't really understand. Just as a slight clarification, perhaps I know you mentioned on page 11 in the book, you talk about biology, minerals and complex compounds. I thought it'd be really useful just if you wouldn't mind to clarify what those terms mean.
Yeah, so I went and looked at what you were referring to, and I was referring to the composition of the recipes in the book. I'm trying to be simple. In fact, these compositions of these recipes are extremely complex, and I evaluated the mineral composition, and that's what's in the appendix. I've also evaluated biological content of some of them, but then again, when you're evaluating biological content, the evaluation is only as good as the ability of the analysis to detect things. And since there's so much biology in there, then I found that I wasn't really clear that I was actually getting a clear understanding of the diversity there. So I kind of scrapped that for the time being. And then there's also complex compounds like hormones and enzymes in these recipe amendments as well. And you could spend a lifetime trying to understand all of that. But the important thing is that all of these amendments are made from plants and represent those things that plants want.
Yeah, there is, again, this is a thing that personally I've come to recently, but the theory behind feeding a plant with, and this is my term, with its own ancestors, how is that beneficial to the plant?
Yeah, well, so this goes back to how indigenous people amended their plants and soil. The plants absorb minerals in their structure in different proportions than the mineral content in the soil. And plants need macro and micro trace minerals throughout their whole life, but they may change during the course of their life. Most soils don't have the needed proportions, and they may not even have some of the micro minerals that are needed. So the idea of using a plant to feed a plant is that the plant amendment has all of those things in it. So by definition, you're providing the plant with what it needs in some level. In fact, most of those soils are very poor, and many of the plants that grow in them are not very healthy. And you can see this by the insect pressure and the airborne pathogens and the other disease that the plants have. So when we start making mineral amendments from plants, I know I'm getting all of the minerals that they need in forms that plants use, as well as the complex compounds that plants have in them. And when you're growing plants in such poor soil environments, by virtue of the fact that there is insect pressure and there is pathogens, then these sorts of amendments are going to be very helpful to that plant.
Yeah. So I was thinking as well, if I was going to make a fertilizer using, say, the leafy part of a carrot, I'm assuming the leafy part of a carrot would have a different requirement in terms of minerals from the root part. So how would feeding a carrot, which we want for it to harvest with a large root, how would feeding that with the greens of the carrot help it? Does it help it?
Yes, the answer is definitely it does. And you're right that the different parts of the plant have subtly different proportions of minerals. For instance, the fruit of a plant is going to have a different mineral composition than the leaf and stem of the plant. But both of them, again, are going to have this complex mixture of minerals and all these other complex compounds. And that's one of the reasons I put the data in the book, is you can look at the data in the book, and no matter what plant you look at or what extraction method you're looking at, these minerals are there. And they may be in different proportions, but they're all there. So if you're starting with a situation where you're in short supply in the soil, or the soil's out of balance, or whatever it is, or there's no availability of microminerals or things like that, then all of a sudden these things become really valuable sources to the plant, especially when you foliar spray them. When you foliar spray these things onto a plant, A, they're in forms that a plant can absorb immediately, and B, they act very quickly. Because they're immediately absorbed by the plant through the plant leaf, they act quickly and form a response to the plant in a matter of hours, rather than if you apply a fertilizer or an amendment to the soil, it may take months or even longer, depending on it, if it's a rock dust or something like that, for that to get into the soil solution, be digested by the soil biology, and then transferred into the plant itself. The other thing is that using, in combination with some of the other mineral amendments like vinegar extractions, you can actually increase macro minerals like calcium during flowering, or use a bone vigor extraction to get phosphorus for fruiting. So in conjunction with eggshell vinegar extractions that have lots of calcium in them, you can actually dial in amendments to specific growing phases of the plant on some gross level. The other thing is that all people in different levels of farming use different tools in order to figure out what plants need. You can do a sap analysis on a plant and understand down to some very unique details, very fine detail, what microminerals are needed from the plant, by the plant during that specific phase. Well, many of us don't have the time or the money or the inclination to do sap analysis. We can also do soil tests and understand on some gross level what might be missing in the soil. If you do a soil test, for instance, and you see that you're missing calcium in the soil, it's very low, then you can use foliar sprays in trenches of something like an eggshell vinegar extraction to get that calcium in, which is extremely important for that flowering phase, for instance. And then the other thing is weeds. Weeds are one of the most unused tool in the garden, I think, that there is. Nature's way of remineralizing the soil is by having weeds grow in unbalanced soil. Those weeds accumulate minerals in proportions that are different than the soil, and then they die and lay those minerals down onto the surface. So by looking at your garden and seeing the weeds that grow there gives an indication of the shortfalls of the soil in that garden. And then one of the things that I started to do is actually use those weeds and make fermented plant juices, for instance, out of those weeds, knowing that that's what my garden needs. So now I'm really working with nature and facilitating what nature is trying to do in the garden, and using those resources to feed my plants.
Yeah, I'm just thinking. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get my head around that. So if a weed generally is indigenous to an area, and if it kind of arrived in your garden or was present in your garden, would that then suggest that it was taking the nutrients from the soil, which the soil actually really needed, or is it kind of remediating nutrients that are lowered down that then need to go back into the soil?
Exactly. There's the rub. Many people think of weeds as robbing the soil, so you got to get rid of them And so they have bare soil. Well, bare soil is just going to dry out and the biology is going to die, and you've lost that diversity in the soil. Rather than that, recognize that weeds are nature's way of remineralizing the soil, and they could be used. Use your weeds as a cover crop, for instance. Fallow fields, they regenerate, right? The reason is because those weeds in that fallow field are providing nutrients back into the soil. Here's an example, quackgrass. I had quackgrass in my garden, and one time I was weeding the quackgrass out mostly so I could grow something in it. And as I was weeding, I thought, wow, I wonder what this might do if I ferment it. And I fermented the quackgrass, and lo and behold, I found it was loaded with minerals, loaded with trace minerals. And in fact, in Appendix E of my book, I list the minerals that are in quackgrass that I fermented. And it suddenly realized that, wait, this quackgrass is regenerating my soil. This is the stuff that I need in the soil. And so now I use that quackgrass and the fermented juices and the vinegar extractions of the ferment residue as amendments for my garden.
It's fascinating stuff. It's literally, my brain is blowing. And another thing that made my brain blow slightly was the ability of plants to change the soil pH in their immediate vicinity of their roots. Can you just, maybe mention a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So pH of the soil is a result of what's going on in the soil. So the plant releases root exudates into the soil and facilitates local biology, feeding local biology. In nature, plants, animals do not expend energy for no good reason. They do it because they know they're going to get a positive return. A plant is no different. And so when the plant exudes these compounds into the soil, it facilitates specific biology. The pH adjacent to the plant root is going to be the result of those exudates and the biology and the minerals that are in that general location. This is why the pH of in the vicinity of the root structure can change as many as 2 units going up and down the root or laterally away from the root. The soil might have a specific pH, but the plant and the biology interface might have an entirely different pH. And of course, pH has a great effect on the absorption of minerals and a whole bunch of other things. But pH is a result of what's going on in the soil. And pH changes very, very much over very short distances.
Yeah, that is fascinating, and something I think maybe a lot of gardeners aren't aware of. Speaking of which, you mention in your book a refractometer. Would you mind just telling us what that is and why you use one?
Yeah. So one of the things that I needed early on was a way to evaluate what was going on in the garden. How healthy is my plant, for instance? And also when I go to the grocery store, how can I measure the quality of the plant that I'm purchasing or the fruit that I'm purchasing in the store? And a refractometer has the ability to do this. A refractometer is a device that merely measures the refraction of light of the plant sap. You literally put a drop or two of sap between 2 parallel plates, and the light goes through, and it bends a certain amount. And this device is calibrated so that the amount of bending, if you will, is calibrated to percent sucrose in the sap. This is invented in the late 1800s to select the right grapes to make wine. You need a grape that has a refractive index on the order of 22 to 24, 26 in order to make a good wine, to get an alcohol content of 12, 13%. And so anyway, so I was introduced to this, and I've used that to measure the quality of plants. I also use it to measure the efficacy of the amendments that I put down. I also use it to measure the improvement in my product that I'm growing in my garden year after year. the refractometer is not a perfect tool. There's an awful lot of variation that can take place. Weather can make changes in refractive index, the time of day, the actual sugar content of the plant changes throughout the day. So there are a lot of variables associated with it. But for $30 or something like that, it enables a tool that gives you some information about what's going on. And when you use it after a long period of time, you begin to understand what those variations are, and it becomes a very useful tool for certain things. And as I suggested before, if you want simple tools to evaluate what's going on in your garden, this is one of them that people might want to get and use for a relatively low cost.
Yeah, I can imagine hours of fun can be had with one of those. So obviously you have loads of recipes in your book. Some are more straightforward than others. But I wondered if you could just maybe mention one type of fertilizer that you produce, and that's the fermented plant juice. So can you just maybe touch on what that is and how often you use it in your own garden?
Yeah. So fermented plant juices is essentially that. It's taking a plant and fermenting it using organic brown sugar. And the recipe is very straightforward. Essentially grab some plants, chop them up, and mix it with a little bit less than equal weights of organic brown sugar. Leave it, put a little bit of a weight on it, and leave it for about a week. And the liquid that that comes about can be strained and put on a shelf and represents an amendment. Let me think a couple things. There's some details on how to do that in the book, but as I suggested before, when you're fermenting plants, you're extracting the minerals and compounds in the plant, and so by definition, you're getting differences of micro minerals for next to nothing, for very cheap. When you think about, well, where am I going to get boron? Where am I going to get molybdenum? Where am I going to get manganese? Where am I going to get cobalt? Well, in fact, these fermented plant juices have all of those things in it. And you can see in the recipes of my book that some have more than others. For instance, I found that fruits have a lot of cobalt in them proportionally. So there's a great source of cobalt. Oh, by the way, now I know why fruits are so good for me, because they're loaded with all these trace minerals. The other thing about fermented plant juices is this recipe is shelf stable. So I might get a half a gallon, make a half a gallon of this mixture and end up with, call it a quart of fermented plant juice. Sorry for using the English system. Let's call it a liter just for fun. And these things are diluted 500 to 1. So if you had a liter or a half a liter of this fermented plant juice that you made in your kitchen, just about nothing, and you're going to dilute it 500 to 1, that gives you 250 liters of this mixture as an amendment for your garden. So not only does it contain all of the trace minerals that plants need, not only is it in a form that plants can use as a foliar spray directly, not only is it shelf stable, not only is it diluted 500 to 1, it's really easy to make, and it really works. Especially, again, as we pointed out earlier, if your soil is lacking the proportions or the trace minerals that it needs, and you're in a tough environment for growing, then the application of these fermented plant juices on a regular basis throughout the growing season will provide the plant with those trace minerals it needs and greatly improve the health of the plant.
Obviously, you're a proponent of this. You use it in your own garden. What difference have these amendments made in your garden?
Oh, geez. So the first thing that I recognized when I started using these sorts of practices was that why would I restrict these amendment practices to just my garden? And why wouldn't I apply this to my entire yard, to the entire space that I live in? And so I quickly recognized that, no, I don't want to amend and regenerate in a sustainable fashion just my garden. I want to do my entire property, all the land, to use the American phrase, the yard. And so I started doing that. And the first thing that we recognized was the absolute amazing number of pollinators that started appearing. We'd have some different shrubs that in any given year, and you notice this you walk by this shrub and all of a sudden the din of noise is so loud. You turn your head and you say, what is this? And it's just this amazing conglomeration of insects, all different kinds and varieties, some that I've never even seen before, just chowing down the plant, the nectars and the pollens on these plants. So it was the increase in diversity that was the first thing, increase in pollinator diversity that was the first thing, and that it happened in my entire yard rather than on the plants specifically. The other thing was that I've been growing my own garlic, about a year's supply of garlic for maybe 20 years or more, and there came a time when the garlic seemed to be getting more susceptible to disease. It didn't store as well for as long. And when I started invoking these ideas on the garlic, it quickly rebounded and it became more healthy, harder, and more number of cloves per bulb. The bulbs are getting bigger and things like that. Same with potatoes. I started off getting like 7-8 potatoes per plant, and this year I was getting 18, 19 potatoes per plant. What else? Oh, one of the funnest things is to see the lovely sheen on a potato plant, for instance, that really thick, glossy leaf, and know that it's a wicked healthy potato plant. And then one day I see potato bugs on it. Well, the potato bugs aren't eating the potatoes, but they're there, and it's an indication that maybe things are slacking off. And applying a foliar spray of stink nettle, for instance, or dandelion, and watching the insects disappear from the potato plant as you're bringing the health of the plant up above that threshold where insects can no longer digest the plant because the sap sugars are high and insects don't have the enzymes in their gut to digest them. There's times when the plants are having trouble flowering. For instance, last year, I had some cucumbers and they started to flower, but they never flowered. And it was like about a week. It's like, well, what's going on here? And I recognized that, they need phosphorus during flowering. And so getting some vinegar extracted bones that have huge phosphorus content in them and mixing them up and spraying foliar spraying the cucumbers, and almost immediately getting flower blooms from that. It just goes on and on and on. And the other thing is it's not just the pollinators that are changing in the lawn. It's the animals that are coming around. The birds have actually changed because they recognize that there's things to feed on that maybe weren't there before as the soil itself becomes more healthy. So it's a change of the entire ecosystem. And it's just so pleasant and delightful to observe and be part of, because rather than using pesticide, which you think is killing one specific thing, but is actually killing perhaps huge portions of the ecosystem, using these methods and watching things thrive is just fascinating and just so pleasant to be part of nature rather than trying to fight nature.
Yeah, sounds amazing. You haven't got anything that keeps mice and rats off of bean seeds, have you, by any chance? I ask half jokingly, but they are a problem.
They are. And, it's so funny you asked that. I wasn't going to get into some of there's some recipes that I don't have in the book that I've used. I haven't talked about the efficacy of the biological recipes, but since you asked about rodents, I have some peach trees that put out some pretty darn nice peaches. And last summer, the peach tree, one of my favorite peach trees, started ripening the fruit. And of course, I noticed, okay, somebody's been in here. And so I camped out at night and actually fell asleep and missed the whole thing. But the following night, my wife was able to catch 2 raccoons in my peach tree, just having a ball of it all. And so I tried all kinds of things to sway these raccoons to go somewhere else. And I didn't want to shoot them. And so the long story short is they ate an awful lot of my peaches. In fact, I had about 3 times the peaches that I had last year, and I harvested and put in the freezer about half the number of peaches that I did last year. Well, time went on, and another peach tree came to be ripened, and I thought, okay, here we go again. And sure enough, one night, the 2 raccoons, they started eating the peaches again. And I thought, okay, I got to try something completely different here. And so what I did is I put a piece of chicken fence around the peach tree at a fairly wide diameter around the bottom, maybe 6-8 feet diameter around the bottom of the peach tree. Chicken wire is only about 2 feet tall, very easy for a raccoon to get across. But what I did is I took the garlic that I didn't eat last year. I had a couple pounds of garlic that I didn't get through last year, and I simmered it on the stove in water for about 8 hours. And I took that and strained it, and I kept it. And I use that as for multi-purposes. I spray it my trees in the wintertime to thwart pathogens. But I also thought to myself man, this stuff smells god-awful. I bet you raccoons don't like it. And so I sprayed the garlic juice, if you will. I diluted like 20 to 1 or something like that. And I sprayed it all around the grass and all of that chicken wire fence, thinking to myself, okay, if the raccoon wants to get in, it's going to either have to climb over this fence or go under the fence, and it's going to have to get through garlic smell. Guess what? No raccoon problems. I think that the smell was just so bad that they didn't want to walk around like that.
Probably. Well, there you go. That sounds like book 2 to me. Well, thank you very much to Nigel for taking part in this episode and for talking about his fascinating work. If you pick up a copy of the book, I'd love to know which recipes you try and the results that you see. Thanks as well to gardencourses.com for sponsoring this episode. Here's Dr. Ian Bedford talking about a bug that will also do wonders for your garden. Well, at least if you're in the UK anyway.
The 19th century naturalist, Charles Darwin, is probably best known for his voyages of discovery on HMS Beagle and for his studies of the Galapagos wildlife, and the resulting publication entitled On the Origin of Species, which presented his proposal that all species of life descended from common ancestors, an idea that's widely accepted today as a foundation concept for science. Probably less known, though, is that when Darwin returned to England, he developed a fascination for earthworms, which he then studied for many years, eventually publishing his findings in the last book he ever wrote, titled The Formation of Vegetable Mould Through the Action of Worms, with Observation of Their Habits. At the time Darwin started his work on earthworms, they were regarded as pests by gardeners, who would regularly dig them up and destroy them. Darwin, however, was unsure if they were pests, since he'd watched in a quiet spot in his garden where ashes had been spread, how the earthworms underneath pushed up soil until the ashes were completely covered. He wondered that instead of damaging the soil, perhaps the earthworms were actually improving it by mixing in organic matter and making it more fertile. So he set about testing his ideas by placing many different types of food on the ground and observing the earthworms' behaviour. And before long, he had irrefutable evidence that earthworms did indeed improve the fertility of soil by consuming, excreting, and mixing in the organic matter that lay on the surface. He even found that worms had a preference for some kinds of food over others, and wrote that, judging by their eagerness for certain kinds of food, they must enjoy the pleasures of eating. Intrigued by the earthworm's ability to differentiate food types, Darwin went on to look for signs that they had other senses. He exposed them to extreme heat, and then shouted at them to see if they responded to sound. Eventually he concluded, though, that earthworms could detect and respond to heat, and that they had no sense of hearing. He also discovered that worms were extremely sensitive to vibrations, which is something that we see in our gardens when the pattering of rain or the tapping of birds' feet bring worms to the surface of a lawn. Darwin was also curious to know if earthworms might be intelligent, so he spent quite a bit of time watching how the worms he kept in flower pots pulled leaves down into their tunnels. He assumed they were sealing their tunnels from cold air, and that they had learnt the best way to do this by pulling the leaves in by their tips. He then tried the same experiment under warm conditions and found that the worms worked in a slovenly manner, not caring whether the tunnels were effectively sealed or not. Then, when he moved the pots back to the cold again, the worms reverted back to their effective method. These experiments led Darwin to state that he believed earthworms had some degree of intelligence, but he wasn't convinced that all worms were equal. And nowadays, 140 years on, I guess we're none the wiser on the intelligence level of an earthworm, but at least we can continue to agree with Darwin that they're important for the soil, recycling organic matter and maintaining it in a nutrient-rich and fertile condition.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.